Jacob's Well, a popular swimming hole near Wimberley, will remain closed to swimmers for the foreseeable future.
Imagine standing at the edge of a crystal-clear spring that looks like paradise. Now imagine that beneath those peaceful blue waters lies an underwater labyrinth so deadly that at least 12 people have never returned. When scientists sent a drone into the depths of Jacob's Well, they expected to create a map of the cave. Instead, the camera captured something that left even experienced researchers stunned. Evidence that this beautiful spring hides one of the most dangerous underwater cave systems on Earth. Before we uncover what the drone found deep below the surface, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We bring you the world's most fascinating mysteries, scientific discoveries, and hidden secrets. Stories you won't want to miss. The drone slipped beneath the surface, its lights cutting through the clear blue water of Jacob's Well. The first 30 feet were stunning, colors that had no business existing in a cave. Shafts of filtered sunlight, pale limestone walls, glowing turquoise and gold. Water so clear it looked like liquid air. But this was no ordinary dive. This machine was descending into a forbidden zone, a place where at least 12 people have disappeared forever. Scientists watched their monitors as the drone pushed deeper into the narrow, twisting passages that divers call the trap. They had come to map the cave. What the drone's camera captured instead was something else entirely. A discovery so disturbing it confirmed everything the well's darkest reputation had promised. If you want, I can also make this intro more cinematic and viral in Mr. Ballen/Nick Crowley documentary style, with a stronger hook in the first 10 seconds. The Well of Whispers. The first thing most people noticed was how peaceful it looked. On the rolling, sun-baked hills of Texas Hill Country, just outside the quiet town of Wimberley, Cypress Creek flowed gently over ancient limestone that had rested there for nearly 100 million years. The water was shallow, crystal clear, and inviting. Children laughed along the banks, while families spread blankets beneath the shade of old cypress trees. College students gathered on the limestone ledges, waiting for their turn to leap into one of the most famous swimming holes in Texas. At the center of the creek was something impossible to ignore. A perfectly circular hole, nearly 12 feet across, opened silently beneath the water's surface. It looked harmless, almost beautiful. This was Jacob's Well. Fed by the vast underground waters of the Trinity Aquifer, one of the most important freshwater systems in the American Southwest, the spring remained a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year. The water shimmered with extraordinary clarity, making it feel more like a tropical paradise than a hidden spring in central Texas. It had become one of the most photographed natural attractions in the state. To visitors, it felt like an oasis. But appearances can be dangerously deceptive. Every person who jumped into those cool blue waters entered the mouth of one of the most dangerous underwater cave systems in North America. Jacob's Well was never an ordinary well. It was a karst spring, the exposed entrance to a vertical cave system descending deep through layers of ancient limestone into the darkness of the Trinity Aquifer below. The cave had not been carved by people or machines. It had taken millions of years to form as slightly acidic groundwater slowly dissolved the limestone grain by grain, creating chambers, tunnels, and twisting passageways that eventually became an enormous underground labyrinth beyond human design or control. For ordinary swimmers, the journey ended in the first chamber, a beautiful sunlit room roughly 30 feet beneath the surface. For cave divers, however, that first chamber was only the beginning. Among experienced divers, Jacob's Well carried a reputation that inspired more fear than excitement. It was known simply as a diver's grave. Nature had shaped the cave into what many considered the perfect underwater trap. At least 4 known chambers descended deeper into the earth, each one more hazardous than the last. Narrow passages connected them, forcing divers through spaces so tight that every movement had to be calculated. One of those constrictions became known as the birth canal because squeezing through it felt like forcing a body through solid stone. Farther below waited passages with even darker names, the coffin and the final squeeze. Those names were not exaggerations. They were earned. The cave's greatest danger was hidden inside its astonishing clarity. The floors of the deeper chambers were not solid rock. Instead, they were covered by centuries of fine limestone silt, resting undisturbed like pale underwater dust. One careless kick from a diver's fin was enough to throw that powder into the water. Within seconds, perfect visibility disappeared. The crystal-clear cave transformed into a blinding white cloud. Divers called it a silt-out. Inside that total darkness, orientation vanished almost instantly. Gauges disappeared from sight. Dive partners became invisible. Even the safety guideline leading back toward the surface could no longer be found, assuming one had been installed in the first place. That was when panic usually began. A frightened diver breathed faster. Air supplies disappeared at an alarming rate. Direction became impossible to judge. The cave turned into an endless maze. Then the oxygen ran out. Over the years, at least 12 people lost their lives inside Jacob's Well. Some never came home. Several victims remained trapped in places so narrow, so unstable, or so deep that recovery missions were considered impossible. The cave itself became their permanent resting place, silently holding on to those who had entered but never returned. Yet the tragedy never ended the fascination. Instead, it seemed to make the cave even more irresistible. Young divers, experienced explorers, and ambitious adventurers continued arriving, convinced they could reach places others never had. Each believed they would be more careful, better prepared, or simply luckier than those before them. Eventually, local authorities decided enough was enough. Workers installed a heavy steel grate made from thick reinforcing bars across the entrance leading toward the deeper chambers. They hoped the barrier would finally stop anyone from risking another fatal descent. It didn't. After sunset, determined divers returned carrying bolt cutters. Again and again, the grate was cut open. Again and again, people found a way back into the darkness. Jacob's Well refused to stay closed. Eventually, scientists realized that if humans could not safely explore the cave, perhaps machines could. Instead of sending another diver into the labyrinth, they chose to send something that never needed to breathe. On a calm morning, a team of researchers and geologists gathered along the limestone edge of Jacob's Well. There was little conversation. A white van stood parked nearby with its side doors open, revealing rows of high-definition monitors glowing inside. It served as the mission's mobile control center. Their explorer waited beside it. The machine was a compact, industrial-grade, remotely operated vehicle painted bright yellow and built to survive crushing underwater pressure. Known simply as Explorer, it carried multiple 4K cameras, powerful forward-facing lights, and advanced sonar capable of mapping cave walls in complete darkness with centimeter-level accuracy. A thick fiber optic tether connected the vehicle directly to the control van, transmitting live video as it traveled deeper into the cave. The mission sounded simple. Reach the fourth chamber. Create the first complete three-dimensional map of Jacob's Well. A technician carefully lowered Explorer into the 12-foot-wide opening. On the monitors, brilliant blue water filled the screen. The drone entered the first chamber, where sunlight poured through the opening above, painting the limestone walls with glowing shades of gold and turquoise. Everything looked peaceful, almost welcoming. Slowly, the operator guided the vehicle forward, descending along a sloping passage into the second chamber. With every foot, daylight faded. Blue became dark blue. Dark blue became deep indigo. Then, nearly 80 feet below the surface, the the last traces of sunlight disappeared completely. The cave entered absolute darkness. Explorers' powerful lights switched on automatically, sending bright white beams through the endless blackness. The cameras revealed smooth limestone walls sculpted by moving water over countless thousands of years. And the deeper the machine traveled, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary cave. Something waited farther below. If you want the pacing to match viral documentary channels even more closely, the next section, the camera's chilling find, can be rewritten in the same suspense-driven storytelling style. The next obstacle was the birth canal. Even for the remotely operated vehicle, the passage was barely wide enough to fit. Loose gravel covered the floor, and beneath it lay layers of fine limestone silt waiting to explode into a blinding cloud with the slightest disturbance. One careless burst of the thrusters could erase all visibility. The operator eased the controls forward. Power dropped to the lowest setting as the drone crept through the narrow opening with millimeter precision. Every movement was slow and deliberate, carefully avoiding the unstable bottom. Minutes later, the vehicle finally emerged. The third chamber opened before it, a wider, darker void where absolute silence seemed to fill every inch of water. The pilot paused long enough to check the systems. Everything was operating perfectly. Ahead, barely visible in the glow of the lights, was a narrow crack in the limestone wall, the entrance to the fourth chamber. No one inside the control van spoke as the drone moved toward it. The tunnel swallowed the vehicle almost immediately. The walls closed in so tightly that there was barely room to maneuver. Beneath the drone stretched an unstable floor of loose rock and ancient silt, a place that no human eyes had seen for decades. Then something flashed. It wasn't limestone. The operator instantly stopped the drone. A metallic reflection. He zoomed in. The image sharpened. Standing upright from a mound of gravel was a scuba fin. The control van fell completely silent. Slowly, the camera began sweeping across the chamber. Only a few feet away rested an old oxygen tank, half buried beneath layers of silt. Its regulator had become encased in decades of mineral deposits, transforming the once familiar diving equipment into something that looked almost fossilized. Nearby, a torn strip of black wetsuit fabric hung motionless from a jagged rock projection. Then the lights revealed something far worse. Partially hidden inside a narrow crevice, pinned beneath gravel that had shifted little by little over countless years, lay the skeletal remains of a human being. No one inside the van moved. The geological survey had ended. Without anyone saying the words aloud, everyone understood that the mission had become something entirely different. The drone remained perfectly still, its bright lights illuminating a silent underwater grave. The diver's equipment clearly belonged to another era. On what remained of the wetsuit, a faded name tag could barely be seen. The video technicians enhanced the image digitally, slowly. Letter by letter, a name emerged. Kent Mopin. The discovery hit the team with overwhelming force. Kent Mopin was not simply another diver who had disappeared. His disappearance on September 9, 1979, had become one of the most tragic and widely documented events in the history of Jacob's Well. Newspapers covered the story. Rescue teams searched desperately. The loss left a scar on the small community of Wimberley that endured for more than 40 years. Now, decades later, a robot had finally shown investigators what had happened. The footage revealed the truth with painful clarity. The passage itself was unbelievably narrow. Its floor consisted of unstable gravel capable of shifting and flowing like slow-moving liquid whenever disturbed. Kent had not simply become trapped. The cave had buried him. Yet the discoveries were not over. As the camera slowly turned farther into the chamber, another set of scuba tanks came into view. Then another diving fin. A heavy silence settled over the control van. Kent Mopen had not died alone. The drone was hovering inside what was effectively an underwater mass grave, confirming suspicions that had existed for decades but had never before been supported by visual evidence. For the first time in history, the mysterious fourth chamber had been captured in high-definition footage. Until that moment, its existence had depended entirely upon survivor testimony, rough sketches, and speculation. Now, there was proof. Clear, undeniable, permanent. Jacob's Well was not simply an underwater maze. It was an active geological trap where shifting rock and unstable sediment could silently claim lives and preserve its secrets for generations. But one question remained. Who was Kent Mopen, and what had driven him to descend into that darkness in the first place? To answer that question, the story had to travel back to September 9th, 1979. In those days, cave diving resembled the Wild West of underwater exploration. The modern safety standards that divers take for granted today either did not exist or were rarely enforced. There were no universally accepted guidelines, no mandatory procedures, and no authority capable of preventing an experienced open-water diver from deciding that a tank of air and enough confidence were all that was needed to enter an unexplored underwater cave. It was an era defined by courage, ambition, and the irresistible thrill of reaching places no one else had ever seen. Among cave divers, Jacob's Well occupied legendary status. Its mysterious fourth chamber, largely unmapped and reached by only a handful of explorers, had become the ultimate prize, the final frontier of the cave system, the place that separated ordinary divers from the truly fearless. Kent Mopen fit perfectly into that world. He was experienced, fearless, completely captivated by Jacob's Well. Each successful dive had carried him a little deeper into the cave, yet none of them satisfied his growing determination to explore what still remained hidden. On that September evening, Kent was joined by Mark Brashear, a student at San Antonio College. Young, adventurous, and deeply impressed by Kent's experience, Mark eagerly accepted the opportunity to accompany him. They were part of a group of 8 divers who had driven to Wimberley and established a small campsite near the well. The atmosphere was filled with excitement, the familiar mix of anticipation and nervous energy shared by people preparing to do something both dangerous and unforgettable. As darkness settled over Jacob's Well, Kent and Mark finished putting on their equipment. Another diver named Joe entered the water alongside them. He followed the pair through the first chamber, then down into the second, watching as they squeezed through the narrow birth canal and entered the third chamber. Everything unfolded exactly as expected, until it didn't. At the far end of the third chamber, Kent and Mark stopped beside a narrow crack in the limestone wall. Without saying a word to Joe beforehand, they removed their heavy steel air tanks from their backs. Then, one by one, they carefully pushed the tanks ahead of them into the impossibly tight passage leading toward the mysterious fourth chamber. Removing the air tanks before entering was a standard technique among cave divers. It allowed them to squeeze through impossibly tight passages that could never accommodate a diver wearing full equipment. But it came with a dangerous trade-off. Once the tanks were pushed ahead into the tunnel, there was no easy way to turn back. The diver was fully committed before knowing what waited on the other side. Joe hadn't been told that this was the plan. He watched in disbelief as Kent disappeared into the narrow opening. Mark followed close behind. Without looking back even once, he continued pushing himself deeper into the crack in the rock. Joe remained at the entrance. A feeling of dread settled over him. He pulled out his dive knife and struck it sharply against his steel tank. The metallic ringing echoed through the cave, once, twice, Again. It was the universal underwater signal. No answer came, only silence. Joe checked his pressure gauge. His own air supply was running dangerously low. For as long as he safely could, he kept his dive light pointed into the darkness, hoping the beam would guide his friends back toward him. Nothing moved. Finally, survival forced him to make the decision every diver fears. He turned toward the surface, alone. As he began ascending, something changed. The crystal-clear water that had surrounded him only moments earlier slowly transformed into a dense, white cloud. A complete silt-out was spreading upward through the cave. Something deep inside had disturbed the unstable gravel below. At the time, no one knew exactly what had happened. Decades later, the drone footage would reveal the answer. The shifting floor itself had collapsed beneath the divers. Joe burst through the surface into the quiet Texas night. He looked around wildly. Then he screamed for help. Deep inside, he already knew. Jacob's well had claimed 2 more lives. News of the tragedy quickly reached local authorities. The responding police officer immediately contacted Don Dibble, the owner of a respected dive shop in San Antonio. Dibble was far more than a dive instructor. A former Navy diver, he was widely regarded as the finest deepwater rescue specialist in Texas. He had answered emergency calls before. He knew exactly what a late-night rescue request from Jacob's well usually meant. The chances of finding anyone alive were almost non-existent. Still, he never hesitated. Within minutes, he left with his partner, Paul Battaglia, and a team of highly trained volunteer rescue divers. When they reached Jacob's well, the remaining members of the diving group were waiting on the limestone bank. No one spoke much. Shock had emptied every face. One diver explained that he had briefly attempted to enter the passage after Kent and Mark disappeared. He believed he had seen something, shapes, possibly bodies, already partially buried beneath fresh gravel inside the cave. Don Dibble walked quietly to the edge of the water. He stared into the dark opening that had swallowed so many people before. Experience told him what emotion could not. The conditions were impossible. It was nighttime. Visibility inside the cave had been destroyed by silt. Sending another diver into the passage would almost certainly create more victims. He made the hardest decision a rescue leader can make. They would wait until daylight. The operation would begin in the morning. What no one realized was that Jacob's well wasn't finished. Morning arrived carrying a heavy silence. The rescue team entered the water with unusual equipment. Instead of shovels or heavy excavation tools, each diver carried small garden trowels. Inside an unstable underwater cave, delicate excavation was the only safe option. When they reached the entrance to the 4th chamber, they found exactly what the exploration drone would document 46 years later. The passage was blocked by a massive wall of loose gravel. The divers began digging carefully, one handful at a time, but every rock they removed triggered another small collapse. Fresh gravel immediately slid down to replace it. The pile never became smaller. It simply kept moving. The entire passage existed in a constant state of slow-motion collapse. It was like trying to dig a hole in dry beach sand while underwater, in complete darkness, breathing compressed air at a depth where even the smallest mistake could become fatal. As increasingly troubling reports reached the surface, Don Dibble realized there was only one decision left. He would go himself. He refused to send members of his team into a place he wasn't willing to enter personally. Quietly and methodically, he prepared his equipment. Game Warden Calvin Turner volunteered to act as his safety diver. Following established rescue procedures, spare air cylinders were staged at depths of 25 and 75 feet. A safety line was secured from the surface into the cave. Everything was as prepared as experience could make it. When Don reached the entrance to the fatal passage, he paused. He checked his pressure gauge, 1,000 psi. Based on the depth, the water temperature, and the work ahead, he calculated he had roughly 10 minutes of usable air. He looked back toward Calvin. Calvin answered with the familiar OK signal. Don nodded. Then he pushed his head and shoulders into the narrow opening. The cave instantly came alive. Without warning, the unstable gravel collapsed. Thousands of loose stones and clouds of silt cascaded down around him. Within seconds, he was buried up to his arms. Visibility disappeared completely. The cave became absolute blackness. He couldn't move. He couldn't strike his tank for attention. He couldn't signal the diver only 3 feet behind him. His breathing accelerated beyond his control. Every rapid breath drained precious air. The 10 minutes he had carefully calculated were disappearing far faster than expected. As the oxygen continued to vanish, he felt his thoughts beginning to fade. For one terrible moment, Don Dibble accepted what seemed unavoidable. He believed he was about to die inside Jacob's well, beside the 2 men he had entered to recover. He made peace with it. Instead of wasting his remaining air in panic, he chose to end the struggle. He opened his mouth and deliberately began swallowing the silty water. Then something happened. His body refused to surrender. A violent, involuntary convulsion, the deepest survival reflex embedded within the human nervous system, shook him with tremendous force. The movement shifted him only slightly, but it was enough. Somewhere beyond the thick cloud of silt, a light appeared. Calvin Turner had instantly recognized what the expanding silt cloud meant. Without hesitation, he moved forward into the collapsing passage. Reaching blindly through the darkness, he extended an emergency regulator, an octopus line, toward where he hoped Don was trapped. Don's hand found the emergency regulator. Without even seeing it, his fingers closed around the mouthpiece. He forced it between his lips and drew a deep breath. It was the first breath of a man who had just returned from a place where very few people ever came back alive. He had survived. But Jacob's well was not finished with him. During the struggle beneath the collapsing gravel, Don had swallowed large amounts of air, along with the silty water. As he and Calvin Turner began their ascent, the pressure surrounding them decreased with every foot toward the surface. The trapped air inside his stomach began expanding. Just as gas expands inside any pressurized container when external pressure is released, the air trapped within his body continued growing larger. There was no way to release it. The pain became unbearable. Years later, Don would say that no words could truly describe what he felt during that ascent. He understood exactly what was happening. He knew the dangers of ascending too quickly. He also knew that if he climbed too slowly, he might never make it out alive. He faced an impossible choice: ascend safely or survive. He chose survival. Fighting through the agony, he clawed his way toward the surface. When he finally emerged from Jacob's well, those waiting above immediately realized something was terribly wrong. His stomach had swollen far beyond its normal size. He pulled the regulator from his mouth and screamed. The pain, he later recalled, surpassed anything he had ever experienced, despite a lifetime spent in genuinely dangerous situations. It continued for 12 relentless hours. He was rushed to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. Doctors initially believed they were treating decompression sickness. He was placed inside a recompression chamber. Nothing changed. The treatment wasn't working. Then X-rays revealed the horrifying truth. The expanding air trapped inside his body had ruptured his stomach wall from within. The injury had triggered severe peritonitis, a massive infection throughout the abdominal cavity that, before modern surgery, was usually fatal. The surgeon who operated on Don later described the experience in unforgettable terms. Opening his abdomen, he said, was like cutting into a fully inflated basketball. Medical experts had never documented an injury quite like it.